Welcome to Cow Talks. I'm Chris Prevatt,
Beef Cattle and Forage Commodity Director for the Alabama Farmers Federation.
And I am Marcelo, Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida.
And this is our podcast, where we dive deep into the main topics affecting livestock and forage production in the southeastern United States.
From the mainstream media to new technologies straight from our research stations.
From cattle prices to international trade.
From our pastures and beyond.
Join us on this journey as we tackle the main issues affecting our producers and the sustainability of our production systems.
Hello and welcome to Cow Talks. This is Marcelo, Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida. And today with me, my prestigious co-host, Mr. Chris Prevatt.
Looking forward to today's podcast.
Awesome. So Chris and I invited two colleagues to talk about weed management, and that's it. Weed management, not only weed control. We want to expand this topic into integrate pest management here. Dr. Brent Sellers is a professor and center director with the University of Florida IFAS and specializes in weed science and invasive plants. And Dr. David Russell is an assistant extension professor in weed sciences with the Crop and Soil Environmental Science Department at Auburn University. Welcome, Brent. Welcome, David.
Glad to be here.
Thanks, Marcelo. Good to be here.
So I think a lot of us in Extension have, both in Auburn or in Alabama and in Florida, have your phone numbers on speed dial, because especially gets to be this time of the year, people call like, hey, how do I kill this weed? What protocol should I follow for this coming spring in my Bermuda field, in my Bahia grass pasture and all that? I always like to lead that conversation with what are we trying to achieve here. David brought up in a pre-conversation we had an important thing about weed control. Weed management is not necessarily herbicide application. There's a lot more to weed management than just killing the weeds. David, in your line of work and in your perspective, what constitutes a proper integrated weed management plan?
Yeah, so when I'm talking to growers and extension groups about weed management, not just in forages, but all crops, there's an integrated approach. Obviously, our minds often go to the use of herbicides, but we acknowledge that not everybody has access to a sprayer, may not have their own sprayer to utilize herbicide weed control. And so we acknowledge that in forages, I think the basis there is a healthy forage stand to compete with encroaching weeds. So that's number one, the cultural practice of proper soil fertility and proper mowing frequency and proper grazing management, so that the forage itself is the first line of defense against weed pressure. And so there's other options like mowing or disking, but that's disking per se is not often done in permanent pasture. But first and foremost, just promoting a good, healthy forage stand goes a long way in weed control.
Yeah, the disking for me is a very important part, also especially when we're establishing new pastures so we can start from a clean stand. Brent, you have a different reality there because besides pastures, you also work with a lot of rangelands, and then weed controlling that is a completely different game set, right?
Yeah, so there's really not much we're doing in rangelands per se, at least usually not on a broadcast basis. It's normally spot treatment for more of our troublesome invasive species like Kogon grass or torpedo grass or other invasives like that. But it's also the same thing, going out, scouting, trying to be a little bit proactive. Can I manage this land a little bit differently so I don't have those invasions come in? Or what's going on around me? What are my neighbors doing? What do I need to protect my property? Or how do I need to protect my property from my neighbors sometimes? Because people are different. They manage their properties different. So, you kind of have to be aware of your surroundings and kind of see what other people are doing so you can better manage your own property that way.
So in both cases there, one of the first steps is to, well, first of all, make sure we are preventing the weeds to become a problem. And a lot of that is through proper management of the pasture or even agricultural system we are working with. What are the sources that you see the most of weed encroachment? Like normally when you start having a weed issue, what's the main source into a pasture in a hay system?
Say a lot of it is probably man movement, inadvertent man movement of seeds, either by mowers, like you mentioned, bringing in different feedstuffs, contaminated seed, not using certified seed. Not using certified seed is something that a lot of people do as well. But a lot of it also depends on the weed species too. So a lot of our seeds are wind blown or carried by water, and all of that can be transported in different ways. So it just depends a lot of times on the weed species, and some of it is actually wildlife transporting seeds that way as well, either through their hair coats or by ingesting. So there's all methods that weeds are being transported around the landscape. So it's hard to pinpoint it on one. We like to always point the blame on something, but sometimes it's just Mother Nature, and we have to figure out how to work with her.
And David, you work in mosaic that there is a lot more integration of crop land and pasture land across the landscape, and I'm assuming there is products and byproducts coming and going, which presents a different concern about weed control back and forth into both systems, right?
Yeah, there can be for sure. I mean, you mentioned the cotton byproducts, the cotton hulls, seeds, and how that's transported, and the potential there to move weed species that we typically see in row crop scenarios into pastures and vice versa. I think, Brent, you mentioned Kogan grass. I guess Alabama would be the blame for that introduction of Kogan grass moving your way. And I would say the tropical soda apple would be the one coming out of Florida that we're seeing coming up out of South Alabama. So, I mean, quid pro quo, trade-offs there. You definitely see that movement either by wind dispersed seed, like you mentioned, with Kogan grass, or movement by cattle with the tropical soda apple. So those are just two examples that come to my mind.
Actually, our forage agronomists brought in the Kogan grass in the 1930s to Brooksville and Gainesville. So it's not just Alabama's fault.
Well, like many species that become weeds, they were introduced with the best of intentions of production. From the other perspective, the same thing. We had a lot of plant introductions here that really shaped the landscape for the best. We can argue if Bahia grass is a weed or if there's a pasture, right? But that's one of the cases. Let's move into. So I wanted to cover a little bit of a broad perspective in terms of integrated weed management, because I think it's extremely important for our farmers to understand that weed management is not specifically only the chemical control. From my perspective, the first step is always to prevent that weed to be there in the first place, and that is from working to prevent space. I mean, healthy pastures. But both of you mentioned two very concerning weeds that are getting into Florida, Congo grass, and then Alabama, tropical soda apple expanding. What are other major weeds you are interested or at this point in pasture, mostly pasture systems?
So this time of year, we always get calls on fireweed or heartleaf nettle because it's an irritant to horses, it's an irritant to cattle. It's not really toxic, it's just irritant. And if you've ever touched it, it's very irritating. But we also have some toxic plants in central, south, and northern Florida that we're concerned about this time of year. My part of the state, which is central and southern peninsula, butterweed and Mexican prickly poppy are normally my top two that I'm worried about. I haven't had much calls on them this year, which either means I've done a great job telling people how to control them in the past and we don't have any seed sources, or they just haven't seen them yet, which is probably the latter, because we're about the time where it's going to start flowering and they're going to start seeing more and more of it. So I am concerned about that. But then at the same time, our winter annual weeds, they're approaching maturity, which means they're more likely more difficult to control. And they're going to want to start thinking about, if they're a hay producer, they're going to want to start thinking about cleaning up those Bermuda grass fields pretty soon, or Bahia grass in northern Florida. So those are the things I'm thinking about. The other thing I'm thinking about is thistles aren't yet bolting in our part of the state. And this is the time they're the most easy to control. And the other thing I'll say today, I live in a part of the state where we have a lot of permanent grass pastures. So a lot of my recommendations are going to be for permanent grass pastures. So if there's questions about specific instances where people are going to rotate into a different crop in the next 12 to 24 months, and we probably need to tweak those recommendations a little bit.
That's very important because we don't want anything with a strong residual interfering with that crop rotation. David, I think your reality is a little bit different from the weeds. You have a lot of, now we're getting off of the cool season. You have some cool season weeds interfering with the onset of growth on both Bermuda and Bahia. We're welcome to mention a little bit about your tall fascia area, which I have very little knowledge to. But what's the scenario now for weed control in Alabama?
Yeah, so I would say that the majority of our state, we're working in permanent pasture too, grazing cattle, commercial herds. Occasionally, we'll see that annual rotation, cool summer forage spectrum, but by and large, we're dealing with weeds in permanent pasture systems. And so, as Brent mentioned, we've got the similarities there with the buttercup, the butterweeds, the thistles that we expect to see right now and throughout the months of March, April, and early May. There's a lot that we can do, at least from a broadleaf weed control standpoint in permanent grass pastures. There's a lot of 2,4-D, for example, that's applied this time of the year prior to spring green up. And we're not that far along, but maybe as far along in our forage green up as Brent is in North and Central Florida, but we're getting close. We've had at least 7 to 14 days of temperatures in the 60s and 70s here, and we have seen some of those summer pasture grasses start to emerge, but then the last 2 nights have been near freezing here with frost in Auburn and in the central Alabama area. So those have probably been suppressed again, at least for a few days. But I also think about grasses. I'd say by and large, the biggest challenge for us here, or at least me as a weed scientist, is removing grasses out of grass systems. And that's just tough. I mean, we've got a lot more herbicide options to combat broadleaf weeds in grass systems than we do removing undesirable grass weeds in Bahia grass, tall fescue, or Bermuda grass, or a mix thereof. So those are really hard. And I'm thinking about, generally the cool season annual grasses aren't that big of a deal in forage systems because you're either cutting it for hay and getting it out of there in that first cutting, or you're grazing it and taking advantage of it. But it's those summer weeds like the foxtails and the basic grasses and the Johnson grasses and, sandbur. That's a big one that's on the rise. Southern sandbur. Is it a perennial? Is it an annual? And trying to remove those out of permanent grass systems is probably our biggest challenge.
David and Brent, you both hit on this, the differences between the annual weeds versus the perennial weeds in these perennial, like for the most part, let's just focus on warm season perennial because I think it relates to both of you. But, the common management there is likely, mow across the pasture. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that mower is going to have on the annual versus the perennial as it's I guess a traditional thing in Alabama would be to mow in August to knock those, whether they're annual perennial weeds, back during that time period?
Yeah, I think it's really dependent on the species overall, primarily. But I would say across the board on grasses, mowing is not going to really affect the longevity of that plant, other than you might reduce seed production for that growing season, or you might spread it depending on when you're mowing it. It really depends on the species. To me, it's hard to make a mowing recommendation for a grass to say this is how you're going to manage it. It's just not going to work. To me, there might be instances where you could use cattle to some extent or livestock to graze it out, but they have to preferentially want to graze that over your desirable forage. And that's pretty difficult. I mean, I don't think it's not like a broadleaf weed where you can sometimes mow it at the right height and eliminate it. A grass, I don't see that happening. It doesn't make sense biologically to me. So there are some broadleaves where you can mow it at the right time and you decrease their growth for that growing season. So an example for us is dog fennel. We can mow it in August and generally won't set seed that year for whatever reason. So that is an example of where that can happen. The other advantage to that is if you're mowing that in August, usually your behavior grass is pretty mature. So you're actually providing some tender regrowth for the cattle to consume, better nutrient value. So that is a benefit also, plus removing the weeds, reducing seed production that fall.
Yeah, and I would put probably the ironweeds, the Vernonia species, and probably the vervain species, Vina species in there with that. I think there's a lot of benefit if you're utilizing mechanical weed control like mowers to combat those weeds. If you don't have sprayer equipment, to hit those right before the reproductive stage and set them back. Now keep in mind things like dog fennel and those other perennial broadleafs. You've still got the root to deal with to expect those to return the following season. But I think for that season at hand, you can minimize its presence there.
So thinking about those perennial weeds, one of the questions that often comes up is the spring green up the best time to control it, or is the fall prior dormancy a better time to hit those perennial weeds?
Yeah, I think for us, again, when we're considering the permanent warm season pastures, Bahia grass, Bermuda grass, even Dallas grass, that's generally seen as a desirable in mixed grass pasture systems for grazing. There's a lot that those 2,4-D dicamba type products will do for just general cool season broadleaf weed control right now, today, mid-February. And even through March, the buttercups, for example, some of those buttercups may be perennial in nature. A lot of 2,4-D can take care of that pretty efficiently. So for us, I don't think there's a lot of cases where there is a need for those more costly products like the aminopyralids and the piclorams, those products with soil residual, to be used this time of the year, because I think those cheaper options like 2,4-D and the dicambas and even some of the triclopirs are very effective on the herbaceous broadleafs this time of the year. So I generally tend to save those soil residual products like the aminopyralids and the piclorams for after spring green up for those perennial broadleafs.
So I would agree with David on most of that, except his environment's a little bit different than ours because frost would kill his tropical soda apple pretty significantly. Ours tends to take off in December, and they're really evident this time of year. Sometimes it's the only dark green thing that you see in the pasture, especially after a light frost, because the light frost doesn't do much tropical soda apple. So in those cases, we do have to use the stronger products, anything containing aminopyralid to kill or manage the tropical soda apple. Going back to Marcelo's question about the perennial timing on perennial species, I go back to it depends. So generally, in most cases, if you're treating at the flowering stage, and that may not always be in the fall, right? But generally, if you're treating in the flowering stage, that's when the plant's sending its energy down to the root system. That's typically when you want to spray. The one exception, I'm sure there's more, but one exception that I've found in my part of Florida is with flat top goldenrod. People don't ask questions about it till the fall when you see all this pasture that's full of yellow flowers across the entire landscape. And you can spray it with any herbicide we have available for pastures and it's not going to touch it, which is very backwards what we're trained as growing up through our education. But what we've determined is early spring, before that plant starts branching, is when we can get the best control with products like 2,4-D and dicamba. We don't even need the heavier duty products. It's just the general products that we've always had. That's very effective. It's just opposite timing of what we think of.
Yeah, I don't usually have a problem until I have a bad problem.
Yeah, or you don't typically get a lot of the questions until fields are covered with yellow blooms in April, early May, the buttercup. Yeah.
And Chris also has a different approach to weed management in his property, because if you can graze it, there's not a weed, right, Chris?
Yeah, so all the Johnson grass is like one of my favorite forages. And foxtail, while it's still vegetative, I don't really have a problem with it. And I'm mostly in an annual system. But I did just lease 180 acres of centipede. So, David, we're going to have a little discussion because it was very, very cheap. But I've got a big renovation ahead of me there because When I say it's 180 acres of centipede, it is 180 acres of centipede that I'm not allowed to sod.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like you're in the sod business.
Yeah, yep. I wish.
My goodness.
One of the 80-acre tracts, I think you could carry 2 cows on it.
That is becoming more problematic, especially in your area across the Black Belt. And, that's a whole different region with those higher pH soils and heavy clay, black soils, because we see a lot of those pastures that are just overrun with those centipede, carpet grass type species that we would otherwise consider turf grass, unimproved turf grass species that don't produce a lot of biomass for cattle. For whatever reason, it thrives in that environment, especially in overgrazed pastures. And we've put out a couple years worth of trials looking at different actives, and nothing seems to work other than glyphosate or maybe Velpar late in the season to even minimize that encroachment. So it's just it's a tough one.
Yep. It's going to be cool season annual forages followed by warm season annual forages, and just continue with the rotation, and we're going to rock and roll with it.
Especially if you're looking into renovation in the future and going back into a perennial pasture, you can use these rotation of annual pastures, annual forages to reduce your problematic weeds like the centipede. So the hard to kills, we talked a lot about several weeds. Most of them are somewhat simple to kill. Not all of them, but there are strategies. What are you facing? What are you seeing out there that is some of those extremely hard to kills that are causing issues for some farmers?
I expect to see more of this with the pushing of more and more citrus in my part of the state. There's more lantana. Once it's established, it's really hard to control. Plus, it is toxic. Weirdly and strangely enough, I have seen a pasture that there's grazing, there's lantana everywhere, and they all seem fine. And I don't understand why they're avoiding it, but they've apparently learned to avoid it. Anyway, there's that. And then I mentioned this to David at our Southern Weed Science meeting, and this is more of a North Central Florida problem at this point, but removing the grass from a grass, Australian beard grass, for whatever reason, has taken hold in North Central Florida. We're working on trying to figure out what we can do about that. Right now, we really don't have anything selective at this point that I'm ready to write home about anyway. Those are the two major ones I can think of at this point. I'm sure there is another one. Spermacosi or whitehead broom or shrubby false buttonweed, whatever we want to call that species. That is one that I have thrown every herbicide we have in the pasture market and not seeing a lot of activity. So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to manage that species. And at one time it was an important nectar source for the larva wasp, which was a biocontrol agent for the mole cricket and the hay grass. So there's some positives to that plant, but with the rate that it's invading across Central and South Florida, it's a little troublesome to me. Knowing that we don't have a herbicide on the market that really touches it is kind of frightening.
I'd say probably the most difficult ones for us, they're really in the grasses. I mean, it's vasi grass that I get the most calls about, full stop, nowadays. I don't know what caused that spike. It almost seemed like whatever year that was, 21, 22, where we had a really wet summer that year, it's almost like the vasi grass came up out of the ditches and invaded all the fields. And then we've had some pretty dry weather since midsummer, and it's just the only thing that holds its own in those pasture systems. So that is the repeat offender and the one I get the most calls about in permanent systems. I do think we've got options for it, but I'd strike that up with those smut grass plants and just those hard to control perennial grasses. And the other one that Brent mentioned that we've got now in the Black Belt that I'm seeing spread, I don't even remember the name of it. It's some kind of, what'd you call it, Brent?
Australian beard grass, Bothriocloa.
Bothriocloa, yeah. So I don't know how many species or subspecies there are of Bothriocloa. I know we see silver beard grass along highway right-of-ways, and it's fine in that environment, but I have no idea what kind of grazing potential or quality it has. But I do know that it is overtaking a lot of permanent grass pastures in those heavy clay black belt soils.
Yeah, it's the interesting thing with the vasi grass too, David, is when I get calls about it, it's usually north central Florida and up in the Panhandle. I don't get a lot of calls in my part of the state where we tend to be wetter. So it's kind of interesting that you're seeing that spike after a wet season, but I think that's where they're having most problems with it too, is in the wetter areas of pastures up in the northern part of the state.
Yeah. Well, and the call that I had this morning is, one that I've had a handful of times in the last couple of years is these paspalums, like the vasi grass, remain green and somewhat vegetative past our frost in the fall, late November into December. And they seem to green up quicker in the spring ahead of Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, is there an opportunity there in the dormant season? I acknowledge that looks different for you in Central Florida. It doesn't really ever go dormant. But is there an opportunity in that window where the desirable warm season forages aren't really growing that actively to do something about these grasses that seem to persist and overwinter? And so I've got a grad student that actually just started on a vasi grass project, and we hope to explore some of those treatments.
I know I tried that a long time ago. When we had a hard frost, I tried that a long time ago. I mean, this is 15 years ago or so now. Sprayed imazapic and glyphosate over Bahia grass that had a pretty significant infestation of vasi. And it did take that vasi grass out. The Bahia grass greened up fine.
That's good. That's good. That's the exact phone call that I had this morning with a grower.
What percent of a field are you seeing in vasi grass? And then my second part was, in terms of smut grass that you're seeing across Alabama, I haven't really seen it thrive like it has in Florida in perennial grass systems where it can take over a field. Like, I've really only seen it become like 10% of a field.
There are some fields in the Black Belt region that are 100% covered with smut grass, but I also know the history of those fields have hay that has been introduced from other fields that have infestations of smut grass. So that seed absolutely is getting moved around. With vasi grass, though, it seems to be more widespread, and across the landscape, it's those bottomland hay fields and permanent pastures that get semi-flooded, in certain parts of the year. I think a lot of that seed is washing up and it's getting established there in those lower fields that may have wetter soils, and then it's eventually slowly moving uphill.
This is an interesting comment you made. You made about the hay, and I think we're getting out of the winter season now. Lots of people are feeding, both feeding hay and concentrate. One thing that's interesting is to observe those areas of heavy concentration of animals in, of course, feed for weed, because that's normally like a focal point for starting a weed encroachment in a pasture, and combating there might be a good management strategy to prevent it from spreading. Last question I had here into the things I've been thinking about. We can talk more later for other things that we didn't cover. But last question I had was, what is new? What is the new concerns of weed? Brent mentioned in the problematic weeds, they overlap the new and problematic just because most of the times we don't know how to deal with them. Brent mentioned the Australian bearded grass. What else is in terms of new weeds of concern we need to keep an eye for and hope to get a head start on them if we start seeing any encroachment of that weed?
I would say the one that comes to mind, in addition to those that have already been mentioned, are the rushes and the sedges, or those juncus, those scirpus and cyperus species, and the carrick species. There are dozens upon dozens of those species that are, I think many of those are actually native to the Southeast, but those don't provide a whole lot of quality, and they certainly don't provide a lot of biomass in quantity to forage production. And in fact, they are a huge competitor to our permanent grass systems. And I'll just give tall fescue pastures as an example, where Tall fescue is growing late fall through the winter and all the way through the spring, and it kind of plays out in our area late June through the end of the summer season. But when tall fescue pastures are grazed, early summer, it starts to turn yellow. But many fields of tall fescue based fields that I've scouted, I'd say over 90% of the fields aren't tall fescue that's turning yellow from the summer heat. It's the carex species like Cherokee sedge and other similar carex species that are present in that farm and on those fields. And it's worse in those heavy clays, higher CEC soils. And, I think it's kind of flying under the radar there, and there's not a lot of quality to it, as I mentioned. And the work that we've done is right in line with older work that Dr. Gail Buchanan did a few decades ago here at Auburn, where he found higher rates of 2,4-D during the spring months. In other words, this time of the year, that has been really the best option for suppressing those carex species. For us, through the majority of the Alabama latitudes, those carex species like Cherokee sedge, for example, tend to hit its growth spike about late February through mid-March. And it often seems that this window that we're in right here is more responsive to a heavy rate of 2,4-D application for weed suppression than any other time of the year prior to reproductive stage. So if you suspect that there are those rush species out there in your field, or those sedges that are underlying your forage bases, then that is an option this time of the year. But I think it's way more widespread than we give it credit for.
Brent, what's in your radar of new stuff becoming a problem?
I think it's more about Australian beard grass and the white head broom or Shelby false button weed. Those are the two that are disturbing me the most right now, mainly because I don't feel like we have any answers that we can give our landowners to help manage them. I'm not even sure mowing's going to help at this point. Trying to figure out what we can do to keep them at bay, I guess, and try to keep them from spreading any further than they are. And I think a lot of it's going to come down to education and people knowing what they actually have out in their pastures or the roadsides in some instances.
Good. David, in Alabama and other parts of the Southeast region that are more similar to Alabama, if people want more information, how can they get some of the resources from you and from Auburn Extension, from Alabama Extension?
So I would point them to our website, Alabama Extension, or ACES.edu. There you can find a lot of the publications that we've put out there, and there's also contact information to all of our extension agents. Our extension system is a little bit different than University of Florida's in that we are regional based, and so we have regional extension agents and some county coordinators that are all on our forage and livestock team. And we work together, specialists, regional agents, and county coordinators all together to cover the state. But there's quite a few very knowledgeable individuals on our team that can help answer a lot of those questions from growers.
Brent, more information from your side besides our email forages@ifas.ufl.edu.
Sure. So I think first point of contact for our producers or small landowners is our county extension faculty. All of our counties have an extension office, but they may not have this particular livestock agent in their counties, but there's usually one assigned to their county. So it's just a matter of contacting the extension office and finding out who they need to contact. Beyond that, we have all kinds of websites at UF, but the Ask IFAS website, they can search for particular weeds, forages, whatever, but then also all of our unit websites as well. So it's just a matter of knowing where to go.
Chris, any final words?
I did have one last question for David and Brent, and I know there's some apps that have been useful to producers to help identify weeds. Is there anything along those lines that y'all have recommended or just want to share?
I like iNaturalist. I don't know all the plants, but that to me seems like a really good app where you can take a picture or pull up a photo from your phone album and put it in the database. It's an ongoing, growing database that's verified by peers, whatever you call that system, that's very efficient. So other people verify that the plant you submit is in fact that species.
That helps narrowing down a lot, defining management based on which weed we're targeting. Well, I appreciate both of you joining. And for those listening that want more information, you also can reach out to us through our email, forages@ifas.ufl.edu, and we can route that question to the relevant specialist and extension agent in your county. I appreciate you joining us and looking forward to our next Cow Talks podcast.
Thank you for joining us on this Cow Talks podcast. We hope you have enjoyed this conversation.
If you have any questions, ideas, follow-ups, or comments, please reach out to us through our email, forages@ifas.ufl.edu. That is forages@ifas.ufl.edu. Or find us on our social media, uf.forages on Instagram, UF Forage Team on Facebook, or UF IFAS Forages on YouTube.